Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Scaling WordPress for High Traffic Sites. Your speakers for today are Drew Gorton, Director of Community and Agency Outreach here at Pantheon, along with our guest speakers, Weston Reuter, Technology Director at XWP, and Jonathan Wold, Accounts Director of XWP. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window or tweet them at GetPantheon. We will answer as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to everyone next week. I'd now like to turn it over to the team.
Thanks, Atusa. Yes, as Atusa mentioned, I'm Drew Gorton. My background is I was a web developer, started off in the late 90s, and I founded my own agency in 2001 and ran that through 2015. And we did projects of sizes of roughly 500 to 5,000 hours in terms of ballpark kinds of numbers. And I had the chance to join Pantheon in 2015, and now I get to work with agencies and our open source communities to help us all get the most out of these awesome tools we share and collectively improve.
My name is Jonathan. I worked as a WordPress developer for a little over 11 years now, and for the past 4 years, I focused on WordPress in the enterprise context.
And I'm Weston Reuter, WordPress core contributor and committer, and I focus on the customizer component of WordPress, and I leverage it at XWP to make compelling tools for our clients.
All right, so as we get started, one of the things we wanted to do is just talk about why scale matters. And one of the things that the very highest level to take away from this is that WordPress can scale really well, but it doesn't do it out of the box. And it's important to realize that that's by design. So WordPress is meant to be as flexible as possible and provide developers with lots of different ways to accomplish what they need to do.
And within the developer's context, it's important that developers understand how to scale WordPress well. When you recognize that because of how flexible it is by design, there are things that it just doesn't do out of the box, and we're going to put some of the things we want to talk about today.
Yeah, WordPress allows you to do things that just don't scale. For example, doing meta queries by meta value, or doing personalization by cookies. These things are made possible by WordPress, and a lot of sites do them, but they can't do them at scale. And so, because WordPress does have humble beginnings, some of the features were originally developed with smaller use cases in mind, like widgets and the customizer. But to use these features at scale, you need to make sure that they're ready for scale, and if not, then contribute to core to make them scale. And WordPress is growing very fast, 26% of the web now, and more people are doing things with WordPress. The edges are being pushed, and it's clear that WordPress is scaling horizontally across the web, but how can it scale vertically for an individual site? That's what we're talking about today.
So before we get into it, I think it's good to sort of start with, well, what does it mean to scale? And I think there's a couple of points. There's how you handle the sort of the volume of traffic, and it's also important to talk about how you handle the really complex data sets. Like, people are using WordPress in really interesting ways with large amounts of data. And then, of course, how do you handle situations where you have both? You have the volume of traffic and you have really complex usages in mind.
And one of the other things, actually, to be mindful of, a lot of the things that we're talking about today are on the site scalewp.io. And we're going to be adding more resources to that site as we finish up today. As we've been working on this webinar, we've come across some additional resources and things like that, and we're going to be posting up. But that site is a community resource. The content is all managed on GitHub, and pull requests are welcome. So if you have input and can help us improve the content we have there, be it like copy editing to new topics, your help is extremely welcome. And this presentation itself will also be shared on scalewp.io. And so we'd love if people were to pick this up and give it at their local meetups and camps. And again, keep helping us iterate it forward and making it better along the way.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I know we came up with a couple new things just over the course of preparing this, so Great resource. It's been a lot of fun to work on. So let's talk about what we're going to go over on this webinar. The objective at a high level is to give you a sense of what it takes to scale WordPress, to take WordPress out of the box and what it does well, and build on that to handle the demands of scale. And we want to give you guys takeaways within each of the topics and recommendations that you can take on. So let's do you can see the topics on the screen. We're going to talk about page caching, object caching, query performance, algorithm performance, how you handle search at scale, elastic architecture. We're going to talk about development workflow, and a real-world scalable architecture, kind of bring it all together. And first step, we've got page caching. Weston, what is page caching?
So page caching is caching pages. It's when WordPress creates a page, creates a response, the page cache will capture that response and then serve that for future requests instead of having WordPress regenerate the request from scratch. And this greatly reduces the server load because instead of WordPress having to regenerate everything from scratch, it can just serve the cached copy. And so it reduces server load, increases performance, users get a better experience, and the server is not taxed as heavily. And this is important because specifically for PHP applications like WordPress, they don't have persistent, long-lived applications like Node.js. So a request to WordPress site is like a blank slate. It has to load up everything, load up all the PHP files, run all the plugins, add all the hooks and filters, load the database, all those things that are needed to build a web page in WordPress are needed for each request. And a lot is involved in that process. And so a page cache will short-circuit WordPress from needing to reload itself entirely to serve the response for a request that was maybe just made a few seconds ago from another user.
One of the things that folks may wonder is like why doesn't WordPress just handle this out of the box? And I think, and we're going to touch more on this. There's a lot of different ways to do page caching, and there are a number of plugins that you can leverage. And other approaches, and we're going to talk about those. But to sort of add to the first point, because there are a lot of ways that things can be done, and not every situation is the same. That's I think, in our experience, it's been one of the beauties of WordPress is it gives you options. So, what are some of the well, I guess I mentioned already the options that we have. We have caching plugins, and we also have the concept of reverse proxy. Let's go to the next slide and talk about our options. What's a reverse proxy?
Yeah, so before I'll talk about reverse proxy, first I'll talk about the caching plugins that are very popular and common in the WordPress ecosystem. It's very easy to install one of these plugins and to make your site scale much, much better very quickly. And these caching plugins are great, and they'll help you weather a storm, but to really survive and thrive in a hurricane, you really need an external page cache, which is reverse proxy. And so in this graph, you can see comparing, I think Joe Hoyle at Human Made did this comparison of Varnish versus Batcache and how they perform as traffic increases.
And in this case, Batcache represents plugins, like sort of a plugin option in WordPress, of which Batcache
is worse. So Varnish is a flat line, meaning that the load doesn't increase significantly as traffic increases. So an external page cache is a reverse proxy, and its purpose is to intercept requests from the user and send back cached responses when possible without ever hitting WordPress at all. So it serves the same purpose as a caching plugin, but instead of being inside WordPress application, it sits outside WordPress and is finely tuned to handle these requests. And this is outside of WordPress. It is more difficult to set up and configure, but you get much more performance out of it.
And we're going to talk about some of the challenges in a little bit. Not yet. It's a little bit. So, what are some of the steps sort of beyond? Well, I guess so. Beyond a reverse proxy, there's third-party options as well. You want to just touch on those briefly?
Yeah. So you can have a reverse proxy within your infrastructure that handles the page caching for you, or you can defer that out to a third party CDN like Cloudflare, Fastly, Akamai, and that will do the same thing in caching responses and serving them out to users, but it has the added benefit of serving those responses from edge servers located near where the user's request is originating from. So not only is it not hitting your WordPress site, but it's also the connection time and the latency over the network is much slower too, because the responses are coming from a location near to them.
And one of the nice things about the third-party options too is that because WordPress is so widely adopted, all of these services will know how to work well with WordPress, and there'll be documentation and all sorts of blog posts about how to set up Fastly with your WordPress instance, for example, and you're going to have lots and lots and lots of help out there. None of these providers is going to say what's a WordPress.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, that's a great point. So should we talk about the challenges?
Yeah, so a page cache will normally be configured to hold on to a response for, say, 5 minutes. So the user hits the site, the response is generated, and then the cache holds on to that for 5 minutes, and each request coming in will just get that cached response. So a challenge there is what happens when you've updated a post, say on the homepage, that appears on the homepage, and you want that change to be visible to users. If you just wait for the TTL to expire, then they're going to have to wait 5 minutes. So caches provide mechanisms to force and validate that, and there's a function in backcache for flushing a URL so that the cache will be purged immediately so that new requests will see the new content. But also, Varnish specifically has a very useful technique where, let's say you have updated a post and it appears as normal on many places on your site. It may appear on the home page, it may appear on your archive page, it will appear on the single template for that article.
Yeah.
But flushing that out across all of your site is challenging to do because you need to know everywhere that it appears. So Varnish supports a header called xDepends_on, which you can serve back in the response from WordPress, and you can basically keep a tally of all the post IDs that you've referenced on your page, and then send that to Varnish. And then whenever one of those posts gets updated, you can send out a request to Varnish to flush every single response that has reference to that post, so that in that way you can quickly purge a large segment of your site so that the new content will be visible right away.
And just as an example, this is a good example, something that we'll dive more deeply into on the website, on the Scale WP site itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like for those who are interested in saying, oh, well, how can I take advantage of this? I'd love to see some examples. So, what about fragment caching?
Yeah. So again, because a page will be cached for 5 minutes, oftentimes there's going to be a region of that page that you're going to want to update more frequently. For example, a newspaper website, you probably have a top breaking news area that you're going to want to keep fresh with the new stories as soon as they come out. And that's a challenge with the page cache because the whole page is cached for 5 minutes. So an approach there is to use fragment caching powered by ESI tags. And ESI tag is like a server-side includes, or like a server-side iframe kind of, that is referenced in the host page, and it contains within it a URL to the fragment to render that specific fragment. And so this is something that specifically you need to have a reverse proxy to support, like Varnish and Akamai, something like that. And so what that allows you to do is you can have the host page cached for 5 minutes, but then the fragments can be instead cached for, say, 1 minute. And also, when in your application in WordPress, when an article that would appear in that top stories fragment is changed, you can just flush that fragment URL instead of flushing the entire homepage. And then in that way you can have breaking news stories appear almost immediately without a significant performance impact on the homepage generation time.
One of the themes that I just want to sort of offer here is that and we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Like, caching can be kind of daunting and intimidating to look at. There's a lot of good options, and part of the first step is looking at a high level and saying, all right, well, what is important to us here? Because there may be areas that you have a point here that there may be fragments that need to update a lot less frequently than the rest of the page, and you could store those in an object cache, which we'll talk about soon.
Sure.
What about cookies? What are some of the challenges of dealing with cookies and within the caching context?
Yeah, cookies are pretty much diametrically opposed to page caching. If you have a lot of personalization on your site with responses tailored for users, then a page cache is going to be a big problem because you're going to start seeing responses served for someone else. And so if your name is John, you'll start seeing, hey, Bob, in your header. And so you want to make sure that you minimize the use of cookies. But if you do need to use cookies, you're not out of options because you can vary the page cache by those cookies. So you could either say that all caching is turned off by default if the user is logged in, which is what that cache does, or you can cache responses based on the cookie's value, for example. Or you could have, in an example of a fragment cache, you could let the host page be agnostic to the cookie, but then just the fragment itself. So if you have like a shopping cart, you could have the shopping cart itself be a fragment, and then that fragment could vary by cache, but the whole page could be cache agnostic.
Cool. So the takeaways here to wrap up and move on. Caching plugins are the quickest win, but a reverse proxy like Varnish is going to yield the greatest wins. Consider fragment caching for your low pieces that need to be updated quickly, and then just avoid cookies wherever possible. You can look at local storage or JavaScript to give you some of those customization when you need it. So next up we have object caching. Can you give us a quick overview, Weston, of what it is? And then we'll talk about where it matters.
Yeah, page caching is concerned with the overall response from WordPress, the response that gets sent over the wire. Object caching is dealing with internals of the application, and so it's like an internal cache. When a page the page can be stored in a persistent external object cache backed by like Redis or Memcached. And so when WordPress does need to rebuild a page, it can then just fetch the previously queried data from the object cache as opposed to requerying all that data from the database. And so this results in a much, much faster page generation time.
So, and to jump ahead, like, what are some, and to go kind of to an important point of what WordPress offers out of the box, how do folks make use of object caching?
Yeah, object caching the object caching API is in WordPress, but by default, it only caches caches values within the lifecycle of the request response. And so you can utilize the transients API with out-of-the-box WordPress to have those cache values persist longer, but to use, because the cache API it permeates all WordPress core data types, so if you want to make use of the object cache for WordPress at scale, you should use an external object cache which will plug into WordPress via a plugin like a Memcached object cache plugin or WP Redis plugin that will then store anything that you're trying to store in WordPress object cache. It will store those externally so that the next time WordPress loads up, it doesn't have to refetch that from the database, but instead can serve it directly from the cache.
This is a good example of what WordPress does. Like the APIs are there to leverage caching, but they're not quote unquote turned on because there's different ways that you could do it. So let's talk about some of the challenges that come with object caching. I'll take the first one, the complexity. Debugging can become a real nightmare when you're dealing with caching. And one sort of jumping ahead, it's really important to have matching environments. You don't want to be saving caching for production. You want to have caching available to you and seeing the implications of the challenges in your development environments as well.
Yeah, it's important to, when you do have caching in place, to have mechanisms to bypass the different layers of caching. So like a query var or a cookie or something that you can put in place to disable a page cache or disable object cache so that you can specifically identify where some stale value is being held onto and isn't being invalidated properly.
Excellent. What about
invalidation? Invalidation is a hard problem. It's commonly identified as one of the harder problems in computer science. But in object cache, you are going to store the result of a database query, and in order to invalidate or remote request or something like that, and in order to invalidate that cache, purge that cache, you need to keep track of the inputs that were used to store that cache value. So if you have the top 5 posts on your site that you're storing in the object cache, you need to keep track of which posts those are, so that when one of those posts changes, you can then flush that cache. And so that can be a challenge to keep with bookkeeping.
Yeah, a good example here is that you update a post title, and maybe you flush the cache is flushed properly on the title itself, and maybe on the home page, but in your top 10 widget on the side, that has to be updated as well. And those are little things that can it's a little gotcha that if you haven't sort of planned for it. On the point of optimization, one of the I think the important considerations is that and I touched on this a little bit, that understanding the business case is really valuable here. Sometimes as developers we can assume that something's needed, like, oh well, this the default of 5 minutes, for instance, but do we really? Does it really need to be updated every 5 minutes? I think it's important to kind of walk through that and make sure, and vice versa. Sometimes the business case says, well, we need this updated every minute. Well, do they really? And because the overhead involved can sometimes more effort than it's worth.
Yeah, because the logic for invalidation can be complicated. Sometimes it's acceptable to just put in place a 5-minute TTL for a cached value and then let WordPress eventually keep itself consistent. And it may not be critical that a cache value be invalidated immediately upon update. It depends on the business use case.
And one of the things actually with that is that it speaks to the importance of having a good discovery process and really talking to the folks who are going to be running this website and understanding what they think is really important, and then having just a good dialogue back and forth about some of the costs and benefits of, all right, so if you want this every minute, here are some of the practical implications of that, versus if this can happen once an hour or overnight or something like that, you could really be giving them a very different solution. And if you give them, say, overnight, and what they need is every minute, obviously there's going to be a real disconnect there, and that will cause problems. And the inverse is also true. You don't want to overbuild something that really is going to cause them a lot of headaches in the future, and really all they need is something very basic.
That's a great point.
And something also to keep in mind with object cache is that the values that you're storing in the object cache, they can be dropped at any time, because an object cache may need to cycle memory, or it may need to make room for something else. And so the object cache should be considered to be a temporary place. You shouldn't be storing anything in there that you're expecting to be permanent. And your application should try to be aware of a situation where an object cache could be completely flushed, even though that should not be happening in production. But if it does happen, having an external object or external page cache will save your site from crashing.
Yeah. So some of the big takeaways here, we have Make sure you're using external object cache, persistent caching plugin like for Redis or Memcache. Those are two excellent options. Make sure you're paying attention to invalidation rules and getting that right. And then make sure you're also really thinking about the business case when you're trying to determine how often, for example, things like invalidation will happen. You really need to understand the use of the people that you're building things for. All right, and so next up, we have query performance. And here is another biggie that we see certainly quite a lot of in WordPress. So why does query performance matter, especially for caching?
Yeah, as I said before, just because WordPress allows you to make a certain query doesn't mean you should make that query. You can have really complicated meta queries and tax queries and make something incredibly complex that results in a lot of database joins and a lot of queries on non-indexed values like meta value, and those are very expensive, especially as a database scales out to millions of entries. And so it is important that in a scaled production environment that you be very careful that you do not use these kinds of queries directly on MySQL. Otherwise, they'll take maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds to respond.
Or longer.
Yeah.
It can get worse when you deal with large data sets. One of the areas where query performance matters a lot is e-commerce in WordPress. I was looking up some statistics on this, and more than 30% of all e-commerce sites, according to builtwith.com, are powered by WordPress. Most of them use the WooCommerce plugin, and there are a lot of really e-commerce is a fairly complex thing. You can run into some really interesting challenges with really complex queries, especially in situations where you have high volume, a lot of transactions happening at the same time. It has to be live, and that there are definitely things that you can do, but there's also challenges with it. So, talk about some of the challenges.
Yeah.
Or anything else you want to say?
Well, with e-commerce, for example, there's going to be a lot of writes to the database because people are making purchases. So, in that case, object caching isn't going to help you because you can't cache and update. And so you need to, in that case, consider scaling out your databases, replicating it across multiple servers, and then using HyperDB plugin, for example, to distribute the traffic, distribute the database queries across multiple mirrors. And in that way, you can speed up and scale databases.
So, speaking of which, what are some of the challenges that you can run into with query routing?
There's a lot of different ways to configure database replication and getting the logic right, and the multi-master, and how to distribute the data across and keep them in sync. That adds a whole new layer of complexity to your application. And also, when there is replication, there's always the opportunity for database updates to have a replication lag between servers.
Yeah.
And so it's important to be aware that an update to a database may not be propagated out immediately across all servers. So if for anything that's critical, push that into the object cache as well at the time of update so that you can refer to the object cache first to make sure that it is consistent.
Excellent. And another important point is the sort of the challenges with debuggability. It's common. It's not uncommon to run into situations where queries seem fine in your development environments, but they're slow in production. There's a few ways to sort of to tackle that. The first is ensuring that one, you're using production data sets, but two, that you're also anticipating future usage. If you're expecting to scale, whether it's in terms of the volume of data or sort of the traffic that you're going to be hitting, you need to take steps to anticipate and test against that scale in advance to give you a chance to optimize.
Yeah,
and another key aspect with query performance and making, a lot of times you do need to make a query that's on the meta value, or you do need to do a taxonomy query that would be slow just in MySQL. And Drew's going to talk about this later in the context of search, but using an external search index like Elasticsearch or Apache Solr will give you the performance you need to be able to do those kinds of queries.
Absolutely. And so some of the takeaways here is that query performance really matters a lot when you're scaling WordPress. And again, e-commerce is an extra special case. And there are some tools. Like the Query Monitor plugin is an excellent tool. It can show you expensive queries and give you a heads up as to things that you might not want to be running out in production. And New Relic is another just fantastic tool for introspecting your application and looking for things that are bogging it down. As we noted, there's a general best practice. You should be querying, or you should be storing the results of your queries in an object cache. Again, can't store the writes, so when you're recording things, there's just no way around that. But anything you're getting back, you should be storing those in an object cache, and make sure you're testing with realistic data. So if you have, you know that this site is going to have 1 million records in a particular table, you running, development environment with 1,000 records isn't going to give you a realistic look at how it's going to perform. So make sure you get a representative data sample for your testing and development environments. We'll add some more post-webinar resources as well onto the site, but let's move on and let's talk about algorithm performance. In some ways related, but it's another important topic. So what is algorithm performance? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, this is closely related to database performance in that the kinds of queries you make will result in a certain algorithm used to obtain the data. And in the same way, within your application itself, you could design an algorithm that could be very inefficient, especially with large data sets. So, as I also mentioned in the initial discussion about WordPress at scale, some features of WordPress were initially designed for a smaller scale. So widgets, for example, widgets get stored in a big serialized array in options table. And when you have more than just a few dozen widgets, for example, a recent site we worked on has thousands of widgets, that doesn't scale. And so in order to accommodate that, you need to hook into WordPress either by a feature plugin that will handle that data in an efficient way, or contribute into core to make sure it does scale. Another example there is with the customizer. Initially, the customizer only had a few settings that were exposed, but then it turned out to be that as that was scaled up into hundreds of settings, the logic for previewing changes to settings would add filters exponentially. So as you get 60 settings, it would take maybe 30 seconds for the customizer to respond. And so that was something that we fixed in 4.4, but just another example of even in WordPress core itself, certain things may not yet be totally designed in a way that it can scale. And so making sure that it does scale, and especially hopefully contributing back the fix to make it scale, will benefit everybody, especially your application that you're working on.
And it's a great point that we were able to, it was fixable. We found the problem and something that we worked on, it was fixable, right? And now the project continues to benefit for it. So our takeaways here, algorithm performance, make sure you're testing your site with, again, very similar to queries, large data sets to make sure that it scales. An important point here is to make sure that you're loading your data as you need it iteratively instead of just trying to load the entire list. A great example here can be if you have thousands of taxonomy values, attempting to load them into a drop-down can cause some nightmares using things like autocomplete. Algorithm performance doesn't just apply to the back end. It's also critical for front-end performance and ensuring a fluid user experience. That's kind of it for algorithm performance. Drew, I want to talk about searching for scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So core search isn't great. It's it's actually something that it's fantastic that search exists out of the box in like at all. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing. Search is a hard problem though, and we all have our expectations set by our experiences using Google or similar search engines, where we start typing and it's going to maybe autocomplete and it's going to give us super relevant results from all over the web just instantaneously. And it turns out Google is also worth billions and billions of dollars, based largely on the fact that they figured out how to do this well, and they continue to be worth billions of dollars because they invest a lot of time and energy in that. It's a very specialized area of computer science. It's a real it's a deep discipline, and I think it's really understandable that core search in WordPress just isn't able to keep up to that sort of pace of expectations. But aside from sort of like that high level user experience, there's also some issues with like how again scalable it is. Weston, were you going to say something?
Yeah, because like you said, WordPress is designed to run everywhere, and so it has a core search with MySQL as its only requirement, and there are additional external systems needed beyond MySQL to make search a really good experience and performance experience.
It's a great point because of what people expect. Like, we are used to going onto Google and typing something and getting something back. And WordPress, for search, basically it does it does the job, but it doesn't scale. One thing to say here, plugins. There are some plugins that you can use to improve WordPress search, but they're fairly limited. They typically start to lose some of their value when you pass the 20 to 30,000 item mark. So if you're within that range, there's some really good plugins options that make WordPress search a lot better. But again, you're just dealing with the limitations of a MySQL database. After that, you have to go to external. And what are some of the options for going beyond MySQL?
Yeah, I would say that the two most commonly paired are going to be Elasticsearch or Apache Solr. Those are the big names in the space. They're both open source. They're both broadly implemented. And what you end up doing when you go to this sort of dedicated technology is you're offloading. You're moving to something that's optimized for search, and it's very quick to sort of fetch a list of posts, for example, and then you have the list of results. You get that in this again. Like what that tool is doing is it's spending time offline going through and understanding all the content that you've got on your site, and then when you fire up your search, you're asking that index. That index gives you fast results, and then it hands it back and says, "All right, WordPress, give me the page that represents all this stuff." And again, that operation is pretty quick. So you take the slow part out, and you also actually improve the quality of your results. So it's really a great win-win for any site that's using a search at scale. You really want to use an external search index.
Excellent. And that's let's jump straight to the takeaways in the interest of time. So yeah, your search matters. Use an external index. WP query, just touch on that briefly. One of the quickest wins is to override it and to leverage an external index. So you still have the power of WP query, but you're using an external index to do the heavy lifting. And then, as Drew mentioned, Solr and Elasticsearch are your most common options for scaling. Next up, we have the speaking of Elastic, what's Elastic architecture, Drew?
Yeah, so all of these things that we've been talking about thus far, page caching and object caching, query performance, algorithm performance, these things are all, to some extent, like kind of on the around or near the application layer. But at some point in time, if you are doing things at scale, you have to be able to get outside of a single physical machine. Your website just has to transcend a single server in order to scale, and that's just it's a cold hard truth. You could buy the biggest 40 core server that actually is hotter than the surface of the sun, and it's running there. But at the point at which you need 41 cores, you have to break out of the wall of that server. And so Elastic architecture is really about the discipline of doing this, and this is sort of really next generation architecture, really. And
that's a good point. Yeah, people sort of have this. It may still be kind of in the back in the past, so to speak, where that was normal. Like, oh, I'm just going to have a big dedicated server. And that's just not the case anymore. It's not the best option.
Yeah, yeah. And if you look at it, if you kind of move on to the next slide, I mean, there are a number of traditional options here, and there are, like there's some pros and cons with all these things. So, the traditional options with all of this stuff is shared hosting, single VMs and clusters, and you use these in different situations. So shared hosting, I think, is something, again, we all know what that is. It's really cheap, it's easy, and those are strengths and weaknesses, right? So it's kind of bad for security, it's bad for performance. It's not something you would want to do with any important site. Be my recommendations. So if you've got e-commerce or transactions happening, personal identifiable information, other things like that. Again, it's not going to be a strength of shared hosting. One of those websites gets a lot of traffic. They're all sort of clustered together in the same machine. All the rest of them are going to slow down, and again, noisy neighbors, etc. Single VMs kind of help with that process a little bit. In you have more resources. You're still stuck inside of a single machine, but it does a better job in security and performance. It's definitely moving into the better zone. And then sort of like the big, again, the traditional architecture, you make a very purposeful cluster, and it's got a load balancer and app servers, and after that, and database servers, some of which are being replicated, and they're really built to, like, if you've ever been involved with building a cluster, it's like a big, it's a big process, and you say, like, we're going to have these many machines and these kinds of cores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and one of the things that produces then is these sort of special snowflakes. Like, it means that the only instance of prod basically is that one cluster that is prod. You can't really accurately test against it. And if you ever need that to be changed, if, for example, you're anticipating a Super Bowl ad, for example, you better give the sysadmins weeks of notice as needed, and they're going to need to bolt on extra pieces wherever necessary.
This is a big deal. Like, speaking from experience, I remember the joy of it's just so fun putting all the pieces together and sort of assembling this snowflake cluster, and then running into some of the challenges that come with that. And we talk about replication lag, et cetera, and experiencing that firsthand. And this is something that we, in the enterprise context, we still see a lot of, where folks are trying to sort of do this all themselves, which you can do, certainly. But it's as you add more and more important pieces to the mix, when you're talking about the context of scale, it becomes increasingly complex, and you can run into nightmare situations, and we've been in those.
Yeah. And if you go take a look at the next slide, the real world, what you end up having is like this whole mess. Like, a single project might have a number of architectures for dev and test, and maybe there's a content approval and a couple other environments, all of which are slightly different. And just in the context of one project, that's certainly a problem. But then in the context of being an agency, like where you are working with multiple clients, you're not just working with this one client with the one cluster. You have maybe 10 or 15 or 30 or 100 different clients, and each of them have their own versions of this, and it turns into a really big headache just to, like, how do we push code on this environment again, and what's the process by which we get a new developer spun up, and what kind of hoops do we need to jump through, and all the sort of garbage of doing this. It's just lost time and inefficiency, and like all of the downsides that can happen from those things. It introduce bugs, and we can't be sure that when the code launches that it's actually going to work, because the first actual test that's going to be in high fidelity is actually getting it onto the live server. So there's a better way to do all of this, right? And so next generation architecture is really doing it the same for all of these things. So on the left hand side, we've got let's say like would be a small site, personal site perhaps. Like you've got an application server up front, or excuse me, a load balancer up front and an application server after it, and it's looking at an object cache with a database down below. And then as you need more, you just pop more in. And this is the proverbial cloud architecture, and it's fundamentally different. When you need more, you just go ahead and change the number from 2 to 4, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 new application containers spin out, and now you're scaling. This is something obviously that we do at Pantheon. We think we've really solved this problem very well, but there are other providers out there too, and we're not the only people in the world to have this great idea. In fact, this is the internet has recognized that this is the proper way to do scaling. Heroku is another awesome service that does this kind of stuff. It's just the way things ought to be done at scale. There are
so what are some of the I was going to say, what are some of the challenges that you can run into?
Yeah, so you do have to have load balancing out in front. It's going to distribute the traffic to the available containers. Sharing files gets to be a little bit trickier. Again, you've got multiple machines in place, and at any point in time, just kind of like Object Cache, one of those machines might disappear, and a new one might come online. Again, it's sort of like the magical mystery, of the cloud. And so you have to be very deliberate about how you store and share media amongst all of these containers that could be accessing it, so that when somebody over in one department uploads a new image, that it's instantly available to every single person visiting every single instance of the website, as well as other users who might be also looking to browse media, for example. And all of this then presupposes an absolute consistency of everything, versions of PHP and configurations for MySQL, etc., so that again things can just kind of swap in and out.
This is a really big deal. That consistency, it matters a lot. Like, it can be like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like, oh, we have a slightly different version of PHP on production versus staging, or this or that. And no, that stuff, we've experienced that firsthand working with clients who have to do their own infrastructure, and things are a little bit different. And when you're trying to narrow down why is this problem happening, it's tough knowing that you have frankly different environments. So you mentioned. And sometimes they can be very different, and that's a real pain point and something that you have to get over if you're going to scale. So
cool, yes.
Next up, we have development workflow. Why does a good development workflow matter, Weston?
Yeah, so for a WordPress site to scale, a scaled WordPress site entails not only just a volume of visitors, but generally it also entails a volume of code. The biggest WordPress sites will usually get a lot of traffic and will have a lot of code that will be behind it to drive the site. And cowboy coding in this environment isn't sustainable for WordPress at scale. Cowboy coding refers to like uploading your files with FTP and doing live coding on the server on production and things like that. So you cannot do this in a scaled environment, especially, for example, with consistency, as we just talked about with an elastic environment. If you're uploading a file, are you going to upload that FTP file or FTP to 10 different clusters? No.
Yes.
So
yeah, and the industry is surprisingly behind here. Like, we started working with a client recently, only to discover that they weren't using version control at all across their properties, and this is not terribly uncommon. And some of the things that you can take for granted in a good workflow, you just don't have, like that point you mentioned there. If you have a bunch of replication, like a bunch of application servers, and you're having to push, like, you can end up, oh wow, I need to push this out to each of them, and that's not good. What are some of the basics?
Requirement,
Yep.
Yeah. So in that way, base requirement here is to have version control, and to let that be a absolute must and fundamental belief and tenet of your development workflow. Everything needs to be version controlled. And with that, to practice continuous integration, keeping the latest changes from production merged into your feature branches so that you don't get out of sync. And as part of version control in Git, the concept of a pull request, popularized by GitHub, is really indispensable for scaling the development process. Because pull request introduces this, it provides a clear history of the changes introduced and who introduced them. It provides integration with, it provides for peer review, which is really important to ensure that common mistakes don't slip through the cracks, and also provides a way to integrate with automated continuous integration servers like Travis CI.
How Excellent. And how within the context of scaling WordPress, how important is code quality?
Yeah, when you get to scale, every little mistake, every little PHP warning notice, it exponentially grows as the traffic grows, right? So PHP notices and warnings, they slow down your application because PHP is encountering something that it didn't expect, right? And these are also often symptoms of a deeper problem in your code. And so in the development process, it's important to have as many checks as possible to prevent those issues from creeping up. So first line of defense in development that we use is having a good IDE like PHP Storm, which will tell you as you're writing the code where the issues are. And then once you're ready to commit, having a pre-commit hook in place that runs automated tests on your local machine before they even leave to go out onto GitHub or Bitbucket. And then once they do get pushed up and you open a pull request, having Travis CI integrated to run those automated tests on production, on that code as well, and also to run that code through tests on multiple different environments, not just your own environment. Yeah. So you could test it in different versions of PHP, and whether it with multi-site, without multi-site, all these different configurations and permutations. And then after all that, after all these automated checks are done, then peer review is the last step to ensure code quality, and having someone else who actually, a real human who understands the intricacies of the application and understands the logic flow, that's the last step. And then after that, after the technical peer review, then there's, of course, the QA process.
Excellent. And let's go to the next slide real quick. And Weston, can you give us just a high-level overview of the kind of, of this development workflow?
Yeah, so the developers working on code on their dev environment, they push it up to GitHub, for example, open a pull request, the code is reviewed, it's merged, and once it's merged, it goes into the test environment, the staging environment. And that's where the QA can be done, and also automated acceptance testing, for example, can be done there as well. And once that passes, and that state, the application state that gets put onto test, gets captured in like a Git tag. So it has a specific version. When it's signed off, it has a specific version that is known to be stable. And then that stable tag then can be pushed up to production. But before that does get pushed up, the database from production can be synced down to the test environment. So not only can the application logic be tested itself, but it can also be tested with live production data.
That's really important, especially for introducing new functionality. That's super important. Well, what are some of the challenges? What can go wrong? What are some of the things that you need to be thinking about when you're sort of setting up your development workflow?
Yeah, as we said before, with environments and consistency, it's important to have your dev environment as close to production as possible. And so if you do have discrepancies between your environments, then issues will creep in, and you'll have issues where you say it works on your system, but it doesn't work in staging, and that doesn't help anybody, even if it makes your conscience feel better. And it's also, so in that regard, it's very important to have a local development environment that can be set up to be as close to production as possible, and we use Vagrant VVV for that a lot. And as part of that, to have a script, provisioning script that will go through and will install Redis. It will install the different dependencies to match production as close as possible, and also as practically as possible. But then to have a staging environment that is actually one-to-one with production.
What about the challenges site configuration? Go ahead.
Yeah, site configuration is another challenge. If you invariably, when you develop a feature in WordPress, there's going to be code, but there's also going to be database configuration to go along with that. And database syncing between environments, parts of databases, is a very difficult problem. And so it's important to use a tool that you can leverage, a tool that specifically addresses that problem, like WP CFM, which allows you to bundle up configuration changes to push between environments.
Yeah.
But that's a difficulty that needs to be carefully considered to make sure that the data that goes along with the code can be easily pushed around and not have to rapidly, once you deploy the code to production, try to click through as fast as possible to configure everything to make sure it works properly.
You don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be relying on humans to do that. What about so what's this about automation?
Yeah, with scaling and with this volume of code, it's really important to automate as much as possible and to reduce the mental load needed to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. So as I said, pre-commit hook, Travis CI, put in place as many checks as possible to check for coding standards, best practices, unit tests, as much as possible, automate everything, including automating the build of your SaaS or your ES6. Just let everything be done in an automated way and collaborate as a team to come up with WP CLI scripts or other utilities that can be used and reused among the team to make everyone's lives better and to streamline workflow.
Yeah, we all know the sort of like the lists of things, like that's a sort of like a something to watch out for. Lists of things that must be done in order to get this stuff live. The shorter that list is, I mean, there'll always probably be a list, but hopefully if you can get that list down to like type the command, boom, done. That's the way to go. So the key takeaways here are you make sure you have consistent environments, automate absolutely everything you can, and really embrace the pull request workflow and use continuous integration. Like there are great, Travis is an excellent tool for automating code quality, building files, pushing code around, and if you haven't already started using that in your environment and you are thinking you're going to be doing more and more scale, you really ought to, spend the time, invest it, and get yourself more and more comfortable with using something like a CI tool like Travis.
Excellent.
All right, and then so that brings us to the real-world scalable architecture. So all of these pieces here. Let's go take a look at the next slide. This is no longer your parents' lamp stack. We're really looking at stuff that's got a lot of layers. So we talked about reverse proxy and object hash and search index and all of these things. Again, these are the pieces that we are now, as people developing at scale, really need to understand and master.
Excellent. And yeah, and these are things you need to same across environments. You can do it yourself, or you can work with providers like Pantheon who can do it for you.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. And so here the proverbial plug, right? So if you got into the web, to see if you want to move us forward, if you got into the web in order to build great sites that scale and not manage all this crap, Pantheon's a pretty good option, as we're a great partner for you. Things like reverse proxy, Varnish is built in. Things like object hash, built in. Search index is built in. Elastic architecture is built in. Database sync for testing, all of it automated. Yes. Git-based workflow between identical environments. Yep, all of the things. And it's all automated and it's all scriptable. So it's a great platform. One other thing to just talk about is the role here of scaledwp.io. Again, all of the stuff that we've talked about here is on the scaledwp.io site. We have a few more resources again that we've come up with that we're going to be posting to the site over time. But we'd love for people here in the audience to start making pull requests as well. Improve the content, find out the gaps, or figure out the gaps, and make all of us better. That's the way community works. We help each other out. So hopefully this has been valuable for everyone, and something that has, again, opened up some new ideas and such. And we know that there are going to be people out there with questions. We have time here available, and Atusa will sort of take over. But also, we're all on the Twitters, and yeah, questions, please.
Alrighty, we have time for just a few questions, but anything we don't answer, we will definitely reach out to you after the webinar. So to start us off, question is, WordPress VIP, which is built by Automatic, relies on backcache instead of varnish. Why is that?
That's a good question, Weston.
Yeah, it does use backcache, and it has been around for a long time using backcache. And I don't know if you have heard of their new platform they're working on, VIP Go. It hasn't widely publicized yet, but you will be seeing a shift in VIP Go to moving away from backcache.
Alrighty. Next question is, we get a lot of server crashes when we have a large load of simulations from form submits, i.e. like 100 visitors signing up for an event through a Gravity Forms form, all writing to the database at the same time. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh to make light of that. I'm familiar with this problem. Yeah, Gravity Forms is an awesome plugin. It makes building forms super, again, I think it's popular for a reason. However, it is not popular for its, say, scalability properties. And something like that is, again, the good news, hopefully, is that you have a setup where you can detect this problem that will, before it occurs, and then essentially you're going to have to give it more resources. I mean, there are, or move away from Gravity Forms. I don't actually have a better option than that. I don't know, Jonathan, Weston, do you guys?
That's basically what we were talking about with all the writes happening at the same time. And I haven't dealt with that specifically, like taking an input like Gravity Forms and then having that spread out over multiple MySQL servers. Weston, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, something to consider is, and I don't know specifically in the context of Gravity Forms how
they
to
have a really good
accomplish
API.
this.
So
yeah.
one of the things. Oh, go ahead, Weston. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you could integrate into it to have it write out the responses to the file system, and then have a cron that will then load them up into WordPress asynchronously, or to that's the first thought that comes to mind. Or also to use deferred MySQL, or is it deferred or delayed? Asynchronous MySQL requests to improve the performance there.
That way you're not pushing them all at the same time. Yep. Yeah, so there are a couple of options, and from my experience, I've worked quite a bit with Gravity Forms. It has a very good API. So there are creative approaches that you could take beyond sort of the standard application.
All right, let's move on to our next question, and that is, how does Pantheon's smooth scaling work within these caching techniques?
Well, let's see. That's either a really long answer or a really short one. In the interest of time, I'm gonna go with short, and I'll say it does. That's one of the things. So the engineering team that built the initial platform and has continued to work on to this day is an incredibly talented group of people. And one of the things that we sort of see, I don't know if anyone else has had the experience of, you find a good hosting provider, and it's good only so long as it remains unused. And then it gets popular, and you simply can't get enough sysadmins in the world, basically, to help give all of the high level of service that they once had. Pantheon's architecture is sort of fundamentally different. Sort of one of Weston's points was like, automate everything. It's all consistent, it's all automated, and it all hooks together. And there's lots more information. I'd be happy to answer that in more detail if you want to hit me on Twitter, or actually even just browsing the Pantheon.io website. It's got some great resources about how all the technology pieces fit together.
I think at a lower level within the context of WordPress, a lot of times when you set up a WP config, you enter in a static value for your database host and your database username and password and those different configuration options. in Pantheon and for a site that does need to scale, those need to be instead environment variables. And so as, for example, Pantheon scales out and adds more nodes to serve the site, the load balancer will then dictate which servers are being used depending on the load. And so in that way, WordPress doesn't need to care. You don't need to care which server you're connecting to with the database or object cache. It'll be all handled for you from the load balancer.
Righty. I'm going to quickly move on to the next question so we can fit a few more in here. And that is, can a large website, for example, Craigslist, where there are always 30K to 50K users logged in and searching, use WordPress with optimization, of course?
I'd say yes.
Yeah.
I'd say yes, and especially by utilizing fragment caching, like I talked about, where the overall page itself is served the same to all users, but then just the individual parts that are specific to a user's authenticated session, those parts can be served as fragments and can be cached specifically to that user.
And so I'm just going to say absolutely very doable. Jonathan Weston, you've up to this point I think kind of resisted dropping any names of the kinds of sites you've worked on, but it might be helpful for people to hear maybe some examples of sites that XWP's done that I think are. I mean, obviously Craigslist is Craigslist. That's it. All of these massive sites are unique in different ways. But
yeah, I guess just to kind of add to the conversation, we've worked on some of the work that we did with News Corp Australia. We're dealing with like 600 million visitors a month, and when you sort of take that down, that's a lot of traffic across the network of properties, and there are a lot of interesting challenges that you deal with at that volume of traffic. But it's all very doable within the WordPress context because of how it's built.
Righty. Our next question is, as you scale across so many databases, what are some best practices for version controlling WordPress settings that typically are stored in database versus code?
So, Weston, I know you mentioned WPCFM. You want to touch on that again?
Yeah. Well, databases in production, if they're replicated across, you should worry in a WordPress context of making sure that those configurations are distributed across. But if you're talking about from staging to production, then having something like WPCFM or WPCLI Dictator or some tool, even RAMP, the RAMP plugin from Cloud Favorite, they specifically address this issue of bundling up configuration changes, and it provides a way to identify a bundle of configuration options to export, and then also provides the mechanism to import. So it provides a standard interface that you can use when writing those features, and if you use the API to properly, then you don't have to worry about those database changes being properly applied on the destination environment.
Right. Our next question is, does Object Cache take care of proxy and AJAX calls within WordPress?
Proxy, what is meant by that specifically?
Yeah, that's a weird question.
Is that like external requests, external HTTP requests?
Sure, let's go with that and see if Dan says otherwise.
Yeah, the built-in, like the fetch feed function in WordPress, I believe it uses object cache by default, or it uses transients, actually. So yes, I think there's actually the WordPress VIP documentation lists out all the functions that are uncached, the ones you need to be specifically aware of to add caching for. So I'd look at that, and you can also see in their plugin code base some implementations of the wrappers around those core functions that are not cached. You can just copy those into your project, and they will add caching on top of the uncached core functions.
right, we're going to take 2 more quick questions here. The next one is, what kind of data and tools are used to determine when to start scaling your apps?
I think in the real world, oftentimes it happens when people notice their site slowing down, or particular things just not working like they should. Like, wait, why is this page taking so long? Or certain save operations, or certain, like people filling out the form. I think oftentimes that's people's experience. Hopefully, if you're building a site though that is like News Corp Australia, you are working with professionals like XWP, and you're relying on their best practices and internal, reflexes and testing procedures to say, we know that there's going to be a lot of traffic, and we're going to do simulations of all of this, and we're going to find those problems before they exist.
Weston, I'm not thinking of any good examples. Do you know of any good resources for large data simulations? If not, we can look at this up afterwards and see what we can come up with. Like, hey, if you want, where do you go to get a really large data set or generate one?
There's a sample. Well, actually, WP CLI has built in a command to build out a scaffold of a lot of posts, and so you can use that to generate a large data set.
And you could sort of define your own data set that way too. Like you could So WP CLI would be the way that you want to go and sort of say, well, let's go ahead and create an environment that has our million posts in it and see what happens.
Yeah.
Right, I think we have time for one more question here. Let's take, does Pantheon support fragment caching?
Yes.
Yes, there's a documentation, and I talked with Josh about this a little bit, but I remember seeing on the Pantheon documentation an example of how to make use of fragment caching, because Pantheon does use varnish, and ESI includes are enabled, so yes, you can use fragment caching. And that's going to be, I have an issue open on the ScaleWP GitHub site to dive into talking about fragment caching. It's not currently addressed in the topics, but with that information added, then we can add some additional resources to get started.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I know we didn't answer a lot of the questions, so we will reach out shortly after the webinar. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any other questions or feedback, please visit our website where you will find a contact us page, and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Have a great week, everyone.